Hey, so I want to do a video kind of expanding on the topic that we spoke about in our last podcast episode about the politics of veganism. And I think in that podcast, we did a really good job at kind of um, going into, in broad strokes, the concept of veganism and where it coincides with politics. But I really want to kind of take a more thorough approach talking about a conceptual framework for what politics means and also for where veganism fits into that. This is going to be part of an ongoing series, not necessarily a sequence, but as these topics come up and as I see the connections between the political dimensions that I will speak about in this video and the the virtues of veganism, I do want to talk about it and be more explicit about this. It's something that I've done in my own writing. And I'll post an article to some things that I've written that kind of talk about this. But I think that in this medium, it's also something that's necessary to do. This is kind of the special thing that the Reason Vegan offers. At a very important time, we've identified and really brought light to the fact that veganism is a political movement as much as it is an ethical movement. And probably even more so in a way, because politics is a tool by which to achieve goals. And if we can utilize our political strengths or our political landscape in such a way to fulfill our goals, that's a great thing. And so again, in episodes as they come along, as I see these topics come up, I do want to focus more on how veganism fits into this conceptual framework of politics. And it's really important, not just for veganism, but politics generally is something that's like really misunderstood. I think that because of the politics of today, people kind of see politics as being a very a narrow concept that is just really characterized by negativity and power brokering and stepping on other people's toes and one-upsmanship, all these negative things that imply kind of battles and us versus them and all these different bad things, and we also kind of stick it in this context of just being about like what happens in the legislature or with the executive branch, or sometimes the executive and the legislative branch, right? All those different dynamics. And it is those things, definitely. But politics is more than that as well. Politics, and this is where I think it's important to focus on, because politics is something that really also exists in non-governmental contexts as well. So just even in terms of small groups, whether it's a formal organization or group or whether it's just an informal small group, politics is something that's pervasive throughout all of them. You can see it manifest itself in the way that people influence other people or maybe influence the group, the way that the group utilizes symbols, the way it associates with other causes, movements, etc. And also how it leverages, or even an individual. An individual or group might leverage the skills or risks of an issue, whether that's for negotiation purposes or for messaging, and also reputation and perception. Now, all of these things are also in the context of what happens in the sphere of government, but it's important to keep in mind that that's not always the case. We influence a level of political engagement when we associate ourselves with a cause. Like in my case, or in the case of many vegans, veganism, adopting and practicing a vegan life, is a political statement. It's a way of exercising my will, my power as an individual, as an economic actor, to choose my own path that is more ethical and more aligned with my values, right? That's a very simple enough political concept. But we don't often put it in that context because we get lost in the conversation about the negative, what happens on the news, what happens everywhere else, right? But it's more than that. It also exists in non-governmental context. It's also another thing people misunderstand is that this is a very natural phenomenon. Politics is not necessarily an intentional result of behavior. Sometimes it's a natural consequence of interacting between individuals or interacting within a group. Sometimes people just have certain demeanors or characteristics or personas that make them naturally inclined, and I won't say naturally again, but make them kind of inherently inclined to lead a group or to work on a technical component of a group, or to be in the background. There's all these different roles that people can occupy in a movement or in a group, and how those roles, those positions, those actors engage and interact, that's a political phenomenon. It's also a net positive phenomenon. That's another thing that people really misunderstand. It's not always bad. I understand that now it might seem bad because the politics of today sucks, but it can actually be a really positive thing. And like I suggested earlier, I mean, if we're able to, identify and align with or exercise political will or strength, we can coalesce and talk about mutual goals and organize and work together, put our heads together, what have you, to fulfill a goal. And like I said, I mean, this is way bigger than veganism. Obviously, we're the reason vegan, so for us, it's about veganism. But personally, politics is something that I am exposed to frequently. I work in multiple different organizations. I work, kind of as a government consultant. So I see a lot of ways that politics manifests itself in administrative context, in small group context, and none of it ever has to do with the legislature. Now, what is politics? It always helps to talk about that because I think that it's something that's simple enough in principle, but it's really actually hard to capture its breadth. It's a big subject. There's a scholar, was a scholar, he'd passed, but Harold Laswell, and he defined politics as the practice of who, quote, who gets what, when, and how, unquote. I think this is a great definition. It's simple, it's pithy, it's very comprehensive though. And when you actually think about what those specific words mean, who gets what, when, and how, it's actually really descriptive too. In whatever context you want to put politics in, so whether it's veganism, whether it's legislative matters, whether it's a local organization that's trying to fight for a social cause, that group, how do they achieve their goals? Or I should say, first, what are their goals? When do they want to organize or plan to achieve their goals, and how do they plan to do it? That is something that you can apply in many different settings, and it explains how politics is embedded within those processes, within that action, right? And then there's more technical stuff. Merriam-Webster, it's equally comprehensive, but it's much more wordy, but I do appreciate it because it is very clear. Merriam-Webster, obviously, since it's a dictionary, they have a very descriptive definition. It's, quote, the art or science of government or governing, especially the governing of a political entity, such as a nation, and the administration and control of its internal and external affairs, unquote. Pretty unambiguous. But these are very like top line definitions, right? And when you crack that open a little bit and you dig a little deeper, I think it's helpful to put politics in certain dimensions where these definitions are still valid, but it's important to realize and break the process down into its component parts. And this is from the obvious, which I just mentioned in those definitions, to the subtle. So they are very independent and interdependent at the same time, these dimensions that I'm going to explain here. The first dimension is the electoral dimension. So this is the politics of elections. This is dilemmas or maybe posturing about what happens during primaries is a common thing. I'm sure we've all heard this commentary, but during primary elections, candidates tend to be more radical, more far to the extreme of the party that they represent. And then during the general elections, they tend to moderate. And that presents a series of political issues and dilemmas not just for the candidate, not just for the party, but for us as an electorate. And those are political matters that candidates have to kind of deliberate and plan for, and all those different things. But what happens a lot is sometimes a candidate will make a statement. They have to be careful during the primaries not to shoot themselves in the foot, for lack of a better way of putting it, when they get into the general election, because they made a very strong claim that they might not actually support, or maybe might not be politically feasible for the general election. And we can all think of examples of when this means. I mean, this was common during the 2016 presidential election, where a lot of hullabaloo was made about Bernie Sanders being a very radical candidate. And the question was, if he did, it was never it was never a possibility. Well, I won't say never, but it was hardly a possibility that he could have ever won the primary election. But if he did, the question is, how do you moderate? Because the chasm between the Democrat and the Republican Party is very wide, and there's a whole lot of people in the middle who are centrists. And how do you get those centrists if you spent your whole campaign so far talking about things that are very far to the left that maybe centrists wouldn't support, right? So there's that part of electoral politics. And then there's also constituent engagement and alignment. So this is simple enough also. You're running as a candidate for a certain jurisdiction or district, and you have to engage with the constituents of that district. And that's town halls, that's campaign rallies, that's advertisements and marketing. But it's also about alignment too. So it's not just enough to engage, but you want to make sure that that engagement is aligned with the values and the beliefs or the priorities of the constituents that you intend to represent. And that's core to a liberal democracy, is constituent engagement and alignment. But it's also a very strictly political matter. It's philosophical, of course. I mean, candidates believe different things, obviously. And they're not just all kowtowing, but a lot of it is kowtowing. And that's just the nature of the beast. And that's okay. I think that you can tread that line and be a successful politician who's principled. It's not often, especially not nowadays, but without making value judgments or anything like that. That's just a descriptive picture of the electoral politics. Now, in a different way, another dimension is the partisan dimension. Now, this is the one that everyone thinks of. It's the Democrats versus the Republicans and the liberals versus the conservatives. Not really going to spend a lot of time talking about it, because I'm sure we already hear enough about it. We already know what these things imply. But it is an important dimension nonetheless when it comes to politics. I mean, this is the most politics that politics can get, right? For lack of a better way of putting it. So, I mean, again, we all know what these mean, the partisan politics, but it's an important dimension. Now, another dimension is legislative. So this is about lawmaking, right? So negotiating, procedure, passing bills, that kind of thing. But it's also deeper than that too, because in every negotiation, in every bill, during every speech that a member might make on the floor of their chamber, they're thinking about many things, and they have to be conscious about many things, and intentional and careful. One of those things is party rank and power. Elected officials, it's never enough power sometimes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. On their merit, people should go to the place in their party that they belong. But sometimes there might be a strong emphasis on party rank and power. You want to get your committee seat. You want to get your name on a bill that's being sponsored. You want to work at a certain level within the party. There's a lot of politics about right now in the Democratic Party. There's an element of who's the voice that's going to represent the Democratic Party, and those are things that are partisan to some extent, but they're also legislative, because they impede or influence the negotiations that are taking place. The other thing that's about legislative politics that elected officials are very conscious of, and rightly so, especially for this, is the interests of their constituents. So for electoral purposes, like I was mentioning earlier, there's constituent engagement and alignment. It doesn't end when you get elected. You do have to make sure that you're constantly representing and voting on the interests of your constituents. Again, that's something that's relatively obvious and expected. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about it. Next, I'll speak about upcoming elections. So this is electoral in nature, but I really put it under this box of being legislative because the candidates or elected officials, or even elected officials who are candidates, incumbents, right? They have to make sure that their voting decisions put them in a good position for their election, and don't put them at a bad position, or don't give them the vulnerability to be primaried, or maybe even have a candidate in another party run against them. So they're constantly trying to preserve their seat every day. Or sometimes they're even thinking about their legacy. And that's electoral somewhat, and that's what I was saying earlier. These are interdependent and independent, but I really think it fits more squarely in that legislative box because it really affects the legislation, the action that takes place from these members or elected officials. Another dimension is the administrative dimension. So these are this is a dilemma, like political appointees versus civil servants. So this is kind of an academic thing, but there's a certain level of expectation that comes from being a political appointee, that you act more explicitly in the interests of the executive, that you try to promote the priorities of the executive, and civil servants, who are just bureaucrats, really try to want to follow the books. And sometimes there's tension there, right? Because civil servants try to follow the books, but it's a political appointee's job to say the books are okay, but the boss really wants this to happen, and that causes conflict. And there are enough examples of this, frankly, in the Trump administration, without getting into that too deeply or talking about partisan matters. There's a deep concern, especially in agents. Well, I'll just say this one agency in particular, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is dealing with a number of ethical concerns because of the political appointees who've been put into the Environmental Protection Agency, and the integrity of that institution, and also the values and the work that the civil servants, the bureaucrats themselves, perform because of that tension. And it influences the culture, it influences the climate, which is another part of administrative politics, because culture and climate is expressly and exclusively, well, maybe not exclusively, but it's expressly and explicitly an administrative matter, because you, as someone working in an organization, you exist in a certain organizational culture and climate, and also as an executive in the organization, you set a culture and a climate. And that can be a very political matter in terms of who you choose to lead a project, or who you choose to have in the room when you're making decisions. So there's those matters as well. And then following the same vein as that tension between political appointees and civil servants, so there's always the matter of bureaucratic autonomy or alignment with the executive branch. And this is core to the dilemma of political appointees and civil servants. It's something that I can spend a lot of time on, but I will not, because it's not germane to the point to go down that road, except just to say that it is a political matter that is important to administrative function and productivity, right, and output. But it matters. It is that is a dimension of politics that is embedded and present and manifest in administrative function. Now, these next two dimensions, these are ones that are not so obvious, but still important, still interdependent and independent with these other dimensions. But there are social politics, So this is, the leaders and the figures um, of whatever cause, movement, issue you align with that's important to you. It's also influences and norms. So, the norms of your culture are going to influence the political behavior that you engage in, or maybe that your group collectively will engage in. And this is also shaped by media. So media, whether it's social media, news, or even like pop culture, like songs, shows, movies, and things of that nature, those are, I won't say that they are political necessarily, although sometimes they are. I think that what makes it political is how it affects the individual and how it affects the group, because obviously these things have influence over the group. When a leader who is important to the group makes a statement or position, the group has to ask itself if this is something that we are aligned with, if this is something we want to follow, or if this is something we want to diverge from. All those different kinds of factors and considerations. And you can take that social piece and you can put it in the administrative box, and you can take that and you can put it in the legislative box, because sociality is, in its most basic form, it's just interpersonal dynamics. It's how you interact with one or more individuals as a group. And to that end, there's also an individual dimension for politics. So this is simple. I mean, or at least for me, because this is something that I've been writing about for a long time. But when you talk about individual politics, this is about choice and association. So this is about, like I had mentioned earlier, for me, going vegan is a political choice. And I think that so is for other people buying electric vehicles or vehicles that are hybrid, or for people in a different way for people who don't shop at Nike because they don't appreciate Colin Kaepernick and they think that the deal that they made with him is bad and he should stand up for the national anthem, all that stuff, right? When you say no to Nike because they made a deal with Colin Kaepernick, you're exercising a political choice to say, I'm telling you and showing you my position on the subject, and I'm trying to twist your arm, twist Nike's arm for that choice, and pressure them to rescind that deal or change that deal or whatever the case may be. Right? It's just it's a vote of disapproval to not purchase anything from Nike. And also the level of enculturation. So you can be in a society that has maybe strong norms, but whether to the extent to which you assimilate or enculturate with those norms, or the values of society, that sometimes is a personal matter, and saying no to those things can sometimes be a political matter, or even in a different way, saying yes for the most part when you're in society, when you're with your group, but when you get home you act a different way, right? I mean, these are political dilemmas you have to ask yourself. How do I want this to affect me? Reputation and perception, like I mentioned earlier. Do I think I would be able to get along better with the people I work with if I conform to the group? So that's about influence over the group, and all those different factors. And you can take all these things and you can put them all together or look at them separately, because they're both the same and different, interdependent, independent. So I think that I just wanted to kind of lay that out as a framework. So let's talk about those dimensions one more time, just to recap. So there is the electoral dimension to politics, there's the partisan dimension, there's the administrative dimension. Now these are the ones that are obvious. We can all intuitionally recognize that these are what we think of when we think about politics. But then there's the social dimension, and then there's the individual dimension. These matter too. They all matter, but these matter a lot, and they don't often get thought about. And if we can begin to incorporate this into the discussion, or maybe talk about it in its as a whole and total, as a framework, a comprehensive framework for for political discourse and political activity, we can really see where we fit into that, and in that vein, over the course of forever, we are going to be really connecting those dots. And I'm interested in any dots that anyone else has to connect in terms of those dimensions of politics that I mentioned, if anyone has any additions, anything like that. But this is gonna, I just wanted to, I'm a little didactic. I love politics. So I really want to kind of, before we talk, and this is one thing I wish we did in the podcast better, was talk about this framework first, because I think that it's hard to put into context where veganism fits into it if we don't know what veganism is fitting into, right? And we can't identify those areas of opportunity or, successes, those areas of efficacy. So in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about a particular topic within the dimensions of politics that I mentioned. I'm not going to spoil it, but stay tuned. It's actually about an article that I wrote recently, which I will post a link to. I'm going to post a few links to my articles because I think that this is something that I've been kind of ahead of. That, again, not a lot of vegan organizations focus on this, and this is what makes us special. And if you think it's special, like us, share our content and subscribe to our content. Check out our website, and follow us on social media, but also support us on Patreon. We really appreciate your support. It's not just a way of saying that you'll contribute to our success and growth as an organization, but just a symbol of the appreciation you have for our work, which we put a lot of time into. So with that, I don't want to spend too much time on these videos any longer. I'm very long-winded, and I no longer want to spend 30 minutes on a video, so I just wanted to make this quick video. This is an important subject to me, and there's going to be more coming out on this subject soon enough. So I appreciate everyone's time, and stay tuned for the next video.